know everyone's very excited to hear about cybersecurity today, so looking forward to talking about it. I'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you very much to INCOMPAS for welcoming me to come and speak today. My name is John Banghart. I'm a Senior Director for Cybersecurity Services at Venable. Most of you probably know that Venable is a law firm. I'm not an attorney, actually. I'm part of a team, a growing team of non-attorneys at Venable that focus on cybersecurity and privacy risk management. For clients, we do significant amount of cyber and privacy policy work, both here in the US as well as abroad. So not a lawyer, but nevertheless, I will say that nothing today should be taken as legal counsel. I'm here to give you my opinions and my views. I've been in this industry now, as my graying hair will attest, over 30 years, even before the word cybersecurity was invented. So I've been at it for a while. And I've got some things that I want to share with you today. As you no doubt know, cybersecurity is a really big topic, right? We could have an all-day, an all-week summit just on the topic of cybersecurity and what it means for all of us. So I've got 30 minutes, and I want to leave some time at the end for some questions. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through sort of setting the stage. I'll talk a little bit about who the threat actors are, some of the challenges that we're seeing. I'll talk a little bit about what governments are and it should be doing. And then I'll wrap up just with some high-level steps that really every organization should be thinking about in terms of managing your own cybersecurity risk. And then happy to take questions at the end as long as they'll let me stay up on the stage. So let's go ahead and get going. I'm going to build out my slides because I only have printouts here up front. So forgive me as I go through that for each one. So I think it probably goes without saying that the cyber threat landscape continues to get worse and worse, right? It continues to grow. The reasons for that are not mysterious, right? The threat surface is growing because we keep adding more devices, whether it's Internet of Things, it's just more computers, it's more websites, it's more things in the cloud. We just do more and more digitally. And that's a good thing, right? There's a lot of advantages that come with that. I, for one, I'm going to talk about some of the scary stuff in cyber, but I'm a huge proponent of technology. Both as at the personal level, I've got a house full of automated stuff, voice assistants and light bulbs and the whole thing. So there are so many benefits that come from technology, but we have to be aware that as we do more and more and we connect more and more, the risk continues to grow, creates more attack surface for the bad guys. And those bad guys continue to grow as well, some of them. So the impact now, because we keep expanding the threat surface, has now also started to get more serious. I've got 4 examples up here. You probably all heard about the Colonial Pipeline attack, right? Which was an attack on a pipeline, impacted distribution of energy. Got a lot of press because what we're seeing now is an increase in threat actors, the bad guys, attacking critical infrastructure, right? And we talk about critical infrastructure. I think we're up to 16 or 17 critical infrastructure sectors here in the US, telecom being one of them, obviously healthcare, where I do a lot of work, energy, which was, of course, the Colonial Pipeline. There's a reason why that's happening, and it's because the adversaries realize, the bad guys know, that if they go after critical infrastructure, they're more likely to achieve their aims. And we'll talk a little bit about what those aims are in a minute. One you may not have heard as much about unless you work in technology, information technology or cybersecurity is the CIRCIA VSA attack. What was interesting about this one, and there's others as well, is that the bad guys actually went after CIRCIA, which was a managed service provider. So they didn't go after CIRCIA's customers directly. That was over 1,000 companies. But instead, what they were able to do is compromise that one company, which then gave them access to that company's customers. So they were, through one attack, they were able to create a backdoor and create a way into over 1,000 companies, right? And we've seen other instances of this as well. That is increasingly, we call those supply chain attacks because it's a supplier. So if you were using CIRCIA or you're using a managed service provider of some sort to help you manage your information technology, they're a supplier for you. And so when we talk about a supply chain attack, that's where the adversaries are sort of going and looking to try and make their lives easier, right? One of the things that we have to realize about these bad guys is that they're very well organized. They operate, many of them, like a business. They think about return on investment. They think about how much is it going to cost me to break into this organization, and is that going to be worth it, right? What do I think is the likelihood that I'm going to be able to recoup my investment and make a profit? So they very much operate like a business. Health service executive. This was in Ireland, but we've seen an increasing number of attacks against healthcare companies here in the US, really globally. But in the case of healthcare service executive, excuse me, they were taken offline, right, for an extended period. Patients weren't able to get procedures done. And you can see the damage, I think, ultimately is estimated to be about $83 million, right, in terms of lost revenue, replacing equipment, procedures, just the administration changes of having to move people's procedures. And again, these attacks are increasing here in the US. We continue to see more and more of them. As I mentioned, I do a lot of work in healthcare. There have been increasing numbers of attacks against HDOs, healthcare delivery organizations, so your hospitals and clinics. But not only those, right? There's a lot of attacks against medical device manufacturers as well. Costa Rican government was an interesting one because it actually took the entire government offline. They're still recovering from that to some extent. That impacted services to their citizenry. It impacted all sorts of just mundane sorts of things. They couldn't issue licenses, right? People couldn't get married. People couldn't do those sorts of things because the government wasn't able to function, because all of their systems were effectively taken offline by a ransomware attack. So those are 4 examples. I literally could spend the rest of the day giving you examples of all of this sort of scary stuff that's happening. But I think this gives you a pretty good picture. And these are all very recent, right? These problems date back decades, but these are all very recent and they're ongoing. Again, just to kind of make the point that this is a real problem that we're facing, and it's getting worse. So a couple things here. Let me build that out. So let's talk quickly about non-state threat actors. And what I mean by that is not countries, and I'll talk about them next. But a lot of organizations here in the US, you're mostly being targeted by what we would call these non-state threat actors who are mostly just out to make money. You can see the numbers here on the right-hand side dating back to, 2017. This is from the FBI. They run a website, an internet crime reporting website. So they collect all this data. You can see since 2017, 2.76 million total complaints, right? So that means that 2.76 million organizations or individuals complained to the FBI through this website to say, I've suffered a cyber attack, something bad has happened to me. And you can see the damages, 18.7 billion over that, 5-year period. I promise you that number is very, very low, right? Because this data, which is one of the few sources of good data that we have, is a fraction of what's actually happening. Because we have no mandatory sort of reporting schemes yet. And I'm going to tell you about some of those that are coming, which will be relevant for all of you as well, or many of you. So the point being is that these criminals are going and where the money is, right? This collective group of these criminals over these 5-year periods pulled $18 billion. Some of that's ransomware payments that go straight to the bad guys. Other of it's costs associated with reporting to your customers. If you've had a breach, it could be replacing equipment and so on. There is a lot of money in being a cyber threat actor, a lot of money. And that's why they do it, right? And that's why more and more of them are getting involved. Other non-state actors could include like hacktivists, right? They may be politically motivated. We've seen a lot of this in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where global organizations of these hacktivists may be attacking Ukraine, they may be attacking Russia, they could be attacking someone else. They're not looking for money or profit. They're simply trying to cause disruption. They're simply trying to make a point about their political views. And so that happens, right? And oftentimes, you may have heard of the group Anonymous is one that was sort of famous for a while. They're still out there. They'll often sort of take on certain targets and say, well, we're going to go after them because we don't like them. If I've got time, I'll come back to a quick story on that, but I want to be conscious of our time. And as I mentioned, and as we saw in the examples, these non-state threat actors are increasingly attacking critical infrastructure, right? So it used to be, if you kind of look at the history here, what you see just generally is that most of these attacks started in the financial services sector decades ago, right? There's a reason for that, because that's where the money is. That's where the credit card numbers are. That's where the bank account information is. And these threat actors, they wanted money. So that's where they would go. They were starting with the financial services sector. Now, in the intervening years, the financial services sector has invested heavily in cybersecurity, right? They have invested very, very heavily. I don't even know what the number is. It's a number probably bigger than I can think of in my head, but it's a very, very heavy investment. That has made them a harder target. They're still a target, but it's a much harder target, right? So there's an old adage that you might be familiar with that if you are in the woods and you're being chased by a bear, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your friends, right? And so from this perspective, the bad guys are saying, remember, return on investment. They're saying, all right, still a lot of money in the financial services sector, but now it's gotten harder. So I'm going to shift. So I'm going to start looking at the healthcare sector. I'm going to start looking at the telecom sector. I'm going to start going after critical infrastructure in the energy sector, for example, because they know that those are easier targets, right? Those sectors may not have as much, say, money or financial sort of power, although they certainly have quite a bit of it, particularly in healthcare, but they're more likely to pay a ransom, right? They're more likely to say, the power can't be offline. I can't be not treating patients in my hospital. I got to pay these guys, right? So they've gotten smart about that. And so they're targeting more and more in that critical infrastructure. All right, what's next? So let's talk about nation state threat actors. These are the ones that typically sort of end up in the news most often. Forgive me, there we go. So nation state threat actors are, there's four big ones, which you can see up there: Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. They're certainly not limited to that. And in fact, what often happens and can be tricky for cybersecurity defenders like me is that you don't always know who a particular threat actor may be working for. So you can look at it and say, well, boy, that looks like they're attacking me from Russia or from China or wherever. That doesn't mean they're actually based there, right? Part of the challenge with the internet is that it's literally global, right? Any computer, these slides are connected to a computer. Maybe it's that one over there. That computer can be attacked from anywhere in the world, anywhere, right? Anything that's connected to the internet. If it's connected to the internet, it can be attacked from anywhere in the world. So these bad guys often will hide in places that don't have sort of extradition or don't have strong laws or are more tolerant. Russia, for example, is a great example of that, right? They're known to tolerate hackers being in their country and operating out of their country. But the governments themselves and hackers that are working for the governments actually engage in quite a bit of threat activity as well. Reasons: military and economic research and development, right? They may be trying to steal intellectual property. We saw quite a bit of this from Chinese government hacking. When I was so I worked in the White House for 2 years, the National Security Council during the second Obama administration. And one of the things that we worked on was the fact that we were seeing these hackers that were being sponsored by or working for the Chinese government were coming and stealing intellectual property, right? They were stealing information about people. They were stealing information from companies so that they could effectively take that and give it to the companies in their economy, right? Basically using those hacking abilities to take intellectual property and empower competitive companies on the world market. So profit can be one. We've seen North Korea, for example, has engaged in what looks like sort of the commercial hackers, right, going after money, but it's nation state sponsored. They've gone and just tried to collect ransom. They've tried to steal money from bank accounts just to have it. And of course, the Iran example is up there as well. One of the big ones, of course, that we're all familiar with in this country is disinformation and misinformation, right? Politics aside, having foreign nations interfere with the information in this country is a problem for all of us. We've seen it during elections. We see it on social media still today. These are nation states in many cases who are actively exploiting the nature of these social media, the nature of the way information gets shared in order to create division, in order to create political problems, in order to just make people angry. And so that is an active thing that is going on. The good news is a lot of these social media companies, many of my friends work there, are doing a better job and continue to figure out how do we separate disinformation from real information or just differing political views so that we can prevent these nations from trying to sow discord. So it's a big problem. But in any event, nation states, we do spy on each other. We do attack each other in these ways. And there's no international norms around it at this point, which means there's no international court, right, where you can say, hey, I'm going to take you to court or I'm going to get you in trouble with some international body, right? That doesn't exist. All right, let me keep moving so I don't run out of time, which Ransomware, just very quickly, you're probably all familiar with this one. You can see the numbers. What's interesting about this is that the number of ransomware, the number of companies paying ransomware has actually gone down. There's some reasons for that. Number one, we've gotten a little bit better at sort of defending. We've gotten the message across to companies that you better keep good backups of your data, right? If any of you are not keeping good backups of your data or your systems, highly, highly encourage you as soon as you're done with the INCOMPAS Policy Summit to go take care of that, right? It's one of the easiest and most effective ways you can combat ransomware is just have good backups and make sure that they work. That's it, right? That's one of the most fundamental things you can do. So that's one of the reasons that we're seeing less ransom get paid. But concurrently, we're also seeing that the cost of the ransoms that are being asked for are going up. And again, that comes back to the fact that they're targeting critical infrastructure. They're going after fewer targets, but they're going after higher value targets that are more likely to pay and more likely to pay a significant sum of money. So we're seeing a shift there. To my point earlier about this being very much a commercial enterprise, you see RAS up there at the bottom, RAAS, that's ransomware as a service. So if you're familiar with software as a service, right, maybe you're using Office 365 or Google Suite or whatever it is you're using, that's cloud-based services. Ransomware as a service is exactly what you think it is. There are gangs out there, these groups that actually develop the tools for breaking in, for hacking into organizations, and other gangs will come along and they'll license those, right? They'll buy them outright. You can get tech support. This is absolutely true. If you buy something from one of these groups, if you buy ransomware as a service and you're having trouble getting it to work, you can actually go back to them and say, hey, I'm paying you for this. It's not working. What am I doing wrong? Right? You can get tech support. You can do all of this. It is a real, real business for these folks. And it's important to think about that because Hollywood, for example, not just to pick on Hollywood, but they often paint this picture of hackers as either being, a bunch of super suave, high-tech people in suits that, just seem to be able to control everything, or they paint them as, some guy in a hoodie in a basement somewhere. Neither of those things is generally true. These are business operations. They operate like a business. They're just looking to make money. So if you think about it from that perspective, it helps you to think about how do we defend ourselves, not only just as an individual organization, but from the government and the policy perspective. All right, let me keep going here. All right, so speaking of governments, what should governments and are governments focusing on? So there's a few things, there's a lot, right? And every single one of these bullets is a topic in and of itself, but just quickly to kind of touch on them. Secure software development is a big one, right? One of the key ways that most threat actors get into your systems is because the software has a vulnerability, right? It has a coding area, it has a bug, right? Somebody did something, they screwed up unintentionally, or it didn't get patched or whatever the case may be. So they're able to get in. So one of the things that's pushing, and we just saw this come out of the in the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy, which just came out last week, and we've heard DHS and others talk about this, is trying to push more to the actual software developers, the software suppliers, to build more secure software. Right. So if any of you are in that business, if any of you write software either to sell or just for internally, there's a lot of great resources out there to help guide how do we make our software more secure, right? How do we make it so that it's less likely to be attacked and less likely to be a problem for us, for our customers, for our partners? So that's a big one. Relatedly is the idea of vulnerability disclosure. This basically means that a security researcher, also known as white hat hackers, these are good guys, if they discover something in your website, in your applications, in your network, the idea is that they will disclose that to you before going public with it. And there's a whole standard around this. One of the other things you can all do is think about, do we have a vulnerability disclosure policy? Do you have a policy up on your website that says, hey, if a security researcher finds a problem in any of your systems, let them know who they should reach out to. Say, hey, tell us about it, right? Don't run off and make it public. Tell us about it first. Give us the opportunity to fix it before they go public with it, right? So vulnerability disclosure and coordinated responsible disclosure, there's international standards around that. It's an important piece, and governments are increasingly building that in. The US government has built that in for their own agencies, requiring agencies to have a vulnerability disclosure policy, and I think we'll probably see a push to do more and more of that across regulated and critical infrastructure sectors. Cybersecurity metrics is a big one. We have a hard time measuring right? I mentioned earlier on that slide with the FBI statistics. That's one of the few sources that we have about what incidents are occurring. How much are they costing? We don't have a lot of that information. If you've tried to go buy cyber insurance, or maybe you have bought cyber insurance, you're seeing that industry sort of shift a little bit right now because they're having a hard time measuring, well, what should the premiums be, right? What does this look like? How do we know what is enough and what isn't enough? So we've seen some sort of pullback in the insurance industry around cyber insurance because we don't have good metrics. So there's efforts to try and improve reporting, which I'll talk about, to try and get more information so that we can start to have a better sense of what does this problem actually look like? How do we measure it? Which then helps us understand what do we need to do. All right, I got to move faster. Sorry about that. Information sharing, I'll come back to, and of course, regulatory harmonization. So let me touch on two quick things. One that'll be relevant for you all, or at least many of you. I'll just talk about the top two. CISA, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, and I'll talk about from the SEC, the Cybersecurity Risk Management Strategy, Governance, and Incident. So CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency here in the United States. There was a law passed, the CIRCIA, that is going to require mandatory reporting, mandatory, right? This isn't voluntary reporting. If you have a covered incident, if you are a critical infrastructure or identified as critical infrastructure, and you have a covered incident, which they're still defining, you must report to CISA. If you do not, and they find out that you did not, they can and likely will refer you to the Department of Justice, who may take you to court. All right? This is a major, major sea change in how the US handles cybersecurity reporting. Now, we've got some time. The law gave DHS several years to figure out what this is actually going to look like. And so they're in the process of doing that. But if you think you might fall into that category, right, it's something that you need to be aware of and thinking about how would we report if we need to. You can see that the timing is 72 hours. Once you have a covered incident, 24 hours you have to report if you paid a ransom. 24 hours, that's it. And again, if you don't and they find out, they will come after you because the problem has gotten that bad. Okay, accelerating to the end here. SEC is the other one that might be relevant to a lot of you, or some of you at least. The SEC has had something of a hands-off approach over the last few years, but I think they've come to the realization that they're in a position to be able to do something around this. They call it material cybersecurity incidents. It's sort of the same thing that CIRCIA calls a covered incident, same idea. There's going to be quite a bit there. What's interesting about the SEC piece as well, that you'll note, is that they're going to start asking you, do you have a board member that understands cybersecurity? Right? Does your C-suite understand cybersecurity? They're going to be asking you to report on those things as part of your filings, right? So these are all things that you need to be thinking about. I'll just mention E-rate very quickly because I know it's on the agenda today. I am not an expert about anything from that other than the cybersecurity side, so I'll leave you all to figure out, the other pieces of that. But our position and the position of the companies we work with is generally that E-rate needs to take into account more cybersecurity requirements and pieces. If you are building a network at a school or a library, anywhere in the world, any size, if you do not have cybersecurity requirements attached to that, all you're doing is creating a future incident. That's it, right? And I don't think any of us want that. Schools get attacked. We need to make that harder, right? We need to make it more difficult. And E-rate is one way in which that we can do that by helping to tie cybersecurity to funding. So last but not least, just a few things that you can think of from a mitigation perspective. I've touched on them a little bit. Remember that cybersecurity risk is organizational risk. It is not the IT person's problem, okay? It is all of your problem. Everybody in the organization, it starts with the C-suite, it starts with the board, right? It has to. It is an organizational risk. Embrace information sharing. Embrace cloud computing where you can. It is not a perfect solution. It does not obviate or does not absolve you of all responsibility when you do that, but it is in one way, particularly small or medium-sized organizations can gain significant benefit by moving things into the cloud where you're able. And of course, I mentioned supply chain already. So I'm going to stop. I think maybe I have 2 minutes that I tried to leave. Sorry, I had to go so quickly, but I'm happy to take a question or two until they pull me off. Yes, sir.
Hey, I'm Steve, Critical Infrastructure Partners. We invest in fiber and data centers.
Mhm.
I was just down in Huntsville last week, and I was curious what your take on redundant routes. Obviously, in Huntsville, there's folks down there looking from Huntsville to Ashburn.
Mhm.
We got the FBI, we got NASA, we got 300 some defense and space contractors down there. How do you see redundant path routes in a place like that? as critical to
Yeah.
cybersecurity?
Yeah, so the question is about redundant routing, redundant routes. I would lump that under the broader topic of resiliency, right? So we talk a lot these days about how do we make organizations more resilient so that if there is an attack, they can continue to function. Redundant routes is definitely part of that, right? It's similar to how cloud providers will have multiple data centers in different regions so that if there's a major weather impact or some other sort of natural disaster that takes one out, you've got automatic failover. And so I think redundant routes are anything that we can look at to say, if something bad happens to this, how are we going to stay online? Whether that's routing, cloud computing, data backups, whatever it is, we want to think about that resiliency.
Federal government agencies like defense, NASA are well equipped with redundant routes right now?
I really can't comment because I'm not sure whether they are or not. My suspicion, educated suspicion, is that it is wildly varied. Right? I think if you look at most DoD programs, things like that, you're going to find that there's quite a bit of redundancy. But I think in other agencies, there probably isn't. Looks like my time is up. I want to thank you so much again. I hope this was helpful. Unfortunately, I'm not able to stick around much today, but you can reach out to the INCOMPAS folks if you'd like to reach out to me. Happy to continue the conversation. So again, thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciate it.